Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Halo Beriti wash processed Ethiopia from Fluid. There's the bag right there. And Fluid, based out of Singapore, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel. As they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. We did pick this coffee up from Airworks as part of their December coffee drop, as it felt like a great opportunity to add another Asian coffee roaster to our catalog for our eventual Asian coffee roaster tier list. And this coffee also happened to sound very much like my type of coffee, even though it's just a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. So it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Fluid's recipe, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 92 degrees Celsius, about 197 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So if we're going based off of other Singaporean coffee roasters that we have had in the past, we've only ever had one, which is Mood Trap, which is an extremely light coffee roaster. So they're nowhere near as light as Mood Trap, as I did find their coffees to be a little bit more developed than I might have expected going into it. And I would say, interestingly, it's on par with the majority of Asian coffee roasters that we have reviewed, which does skew a little bit more on that medium light side of things by most people's standards and metrics, as you're going to see throughout this review that it definitely had a little bit more of those developed qualities than some other coffee roasters that we also review on this channel. So kind of that medium light range by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was notably intense for a washed Ethiopian coffee, lending the question as to what roasting machine they were using, because it does have a much more rich feel to it. And right off the bat, I feel like you can tell if a coffee roaster is using a more, we'll say old school machine, or if they are using something a little bit more modern. So I'm obviously alluding to the stronghold or the loring. But there was plenty of the classic Ethiopian characteristics with the stone fruit qualities all presented in a caramelized sense, and we'll get into that a little bit more, as on day 20 we opted for the Chemex, and there was a similar sentiment to it, as there was plenty of robustness and intensity, as it had a very prominent candied aspect to it, reminiscent of old school Probat coffees. And that's a lot of what I'm alluding to in terms of the profile of this coffee, and in addition to that, the roasting machine. Now, funny enough, when I was doing a little bit of research, because I was trying to find out if it's Fluid Coffee or Fluid Collective, or if they're anything other than just Fluid, but it looks like it's just Fluid. I was scrolling through their Instagram and I saw a photo of a Gießen, so my assumption is they actually use the Gießen as their roasting machine, and I also think that Airworks mentioned that to me one time, which probably sold me, given I really like the Gießen. But in addition to that, there was a lingering citric brightness, with the coffee offering plenty of body and texture for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. Day 23 through the April brewer, and the robustness of the coffee continues to be very notable, as it's a little thicker and more intense overall. Best off brew, with the citric and stone fruit qualities being presented before it does settle into a little bit less defined and generic of a brown quality. I know people love using that term, but that's kind of the best description I have for the way that this coffee was presenting itself on this day. Day 26 through the V60 with Fluid's recipe, and there were certainly some mixed results, as it was offering better definition to the Ethiopian qualities, but it was hindered by the overall robustness of this one. Light colored fruits in the citric and stone fruit sense continue to remain present, so I would say that's just a general mixed bag on this day. Day 29 through the Chemex with Fluid's recipe, and this was a massive standout day, and it's really funny just how much of a difference there was between the brew methods on this coffee with these adjustments, because I felt like I found such a anomaly compared to the other days we'd had as of this moment, as there was a tremendously well-defined wild peach feel to it, in line with the listed nectarine. So the stone fruit qualities in this one, immense. One of the best defined that I've experienced from a coffee in this category. And given that this coffee was already skewing a little bit more on the intense side of things, it was very interesting to experience this quality just as clean and well defined as it was. Super fruits forward with an intense complementary lingering florality. An excellent day overall, as I was really impressed with just how much this coffee had changed with these adjustments. Day 32 through the V60 with fluids recipe once again, and it's not quite as good. And it's so funny to me that this coffee changed so dramatically the 2 times that we switched between brew methods, as it does seem to greatly benefit from brewing it with the Chemex. There are some nice peach aspects, but nowhere near as clean and well-defined as the previous day. And that's all I really took in terms of notes for this day, given that I knew we were going to go back to that Chemex. And same thing happened on day 35. Massively improved once again, solidifying this as our preferred brew method for this coffee, as the profile is certainly a little bit more developed than I usually like, but it is rich, pronounced, intense, and sugary with plenty of the citric and peachy qualities to it. So not entirely sure what's to make of the very drastic difference between these 2 brew methods, but on day 38 we went back to the Chemex one more time with fluids recipe, and it did feel like the coffee has started to drop off ever so slightly, as it does still offer a little bit of those robust qualities, but I'm feeling the fruits that at one moment were very clean and well defined starting to lose a little bit of that and being a little bit more generic of a representation of what they once were. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So this one was very clean, and yeah, there's a lot of robustness. I'll discuss that briefly when we get to that part of the tasting wheel, but even with that, the definition, especially with the way that we brewed this coffee, was exceptional. The florality, the citric qualities, the stone fruit qualities, all presented very nice, very clean, and very sweet, so there's no reason why it wouldn't score that level 4. It is hindered a little bit by that slightly smoky quality, but once again, we'll get to that a little later. Finish level 4, and on the day that we did make this tasting wheel, we made it with our ideal recipe. It turned out absolutely great in terms of that finish, as it did leave a very lingering stone fruit-like quality to it, which is always going to sell me on a coffee in general. Even if the profile isn't necessarily something that I like with the coffee, I was really appreciative of what the finish was offering with that very stone fruit-like sense to it. Sweetness level 4. I love the fact that it was presented in 2 specific directions, one of which being that stone fruit quality and the other being in that candied quality, as it certainly reminded me of more traditional coffees, and I can't help shaking the feeling that this one was definitely roasted on the Gießen, given that's what I saw from the coffee roaster themselves, but it also had a lot of similar characteristics to coffee roasters that we also have reviewed recently that roast on the Gießen, so places like Bell Lane, and I know Café Circular also roasts on the Gießen, so definitely some positives that I took away from the sweetness in this one. Florality level 4. If I recall correctly, I think they have some jasmine notes, which would make a lot of sense. This one is definitely presented in a lot more of that floral sense. I mean, we are still working with washed Ethiopian coffee. They are a little bit more intense in that regard as well, which again, fully expected. And it was much more complementary to the stone fruit qualities, which were much more abundant, as the citrus fruit did score high at that level 4. And it's a little bit of a sweeter citric fruit quality. I can definitely see a bit more of like an orange tangerine quality to it. And given that that's the theme that this coffee had, a little bit more of those lighter colored fruits in general, then it's not surprising that that's the primary feel I got from those citric qualities, as the stone fruit also scored very high at that level 4 mark. Nectarine, note they have listed on here, and I will remember that. I actually really love nectarines almost to the same extent that I love peaches, and when they're presented in coffee in this clean and defined of a sense, and is always going to make me very happy. When we made these adjustments to this coffee, that was the most pronounced characteristic to it, so it's certainly the most justified there at that level 4 mark. And then we'll move on to level 3, as we'll start with the acidity level 3. I don't think that the combination of factors that led to this coffee was ever going to make this one a level 4 in terms of rightness. Washed Ethiopian coffee, a little bit more developed of washed Ethiopian coffee, and the machine that it was roasted on. Level 3 is probably the ceiling that this could have ever reached in terms of the brightness. Caramel level 3, I mentioned that it has that very rich kind of brown candy, robust, old school Probat-like candied sweetness to it. So that was another quality that was pretty pronounced for the majority of this coffee. Even when I didn't get it to the point that I liked it, that was probably the highlight for me on most days. So those V60 days where the coffee was just kind of fine, I felt like it was still present and the most enjoyable aspect of this coffee for me. The last 2 things we're discussing, we'll touch on the smokiness real quick. The profile of this one, yeah, it's definitely offering a little bit more of that. So I think if you want to say that it's even a little bit more developed than you would typically expect from your average American coffee roaster, like I'm trying to think of a good example. It kind of reminds me of a little bit more developed Ilsa or something along those lines. And as a result, I wasn't the biggest fan of the profile, but I think it was made up for given that it had immense clarity in certain aspects. And then the final thing we're discussing, body level 2. At least it had a little bit of texture. That's something I can also give it. I mentioned early on that it did have that just kind of more heavier feel to it on the earlier days. And I think that had we gone with the V60, I probably could have even justified that being there at the level 3 mark. But Chemex was always going to give it a little bit lighter of a body in general. And it is a washed Ethiopian coffee, but even then higher side of the level 2 for whatever that's worth. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my raw thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It is going to be kind of funny when we discuss the other coffee that we did review from Fluid, because in a lot of ways, it is the opposite of what we experienced with this coffee. But the profile, starting with that, it's not what I'm usually looking for in coffees these days. It's just a little bit further along than I typically like. But what's so interesting and fun about this coffee is just how good it was the days that we brewed it with a recipe that we settled on. Because there is such a stark contrast. If the coffee would have remained the same way it was for the first 4 times that I brewed it, I would have found this coffee to be something that I'm like, it's not my thing. I don't necessarily enjoy it. But towards the end, I'm like, it's a little bit of a guilty pleasure, because when you get it at its very best, yeah, it's not my profile. Yeah, it's offering some characteristics I don't like, but it's made up for by the wonderful characteristics that it does offer. So take the very good with the negative, and I found myself enjoying it probably a little bit more than I should have. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This one is a little bit more traditional. It's a little bit more old school. So I feel like a little bit more of those kind of old school, like thicker qualities of your like candied aspects to a washed coffee. Then this one has that. It's still presented in a very clean sense. You're still getting a lot of citric qualities. You're still getting a lot of floral qualities. You're still getting a lot of those more intense fruit qualities to it. In addition to that, that old school kind of candied feel gives it a little bit of depth as well, and just a little bit more body than an average washed Ethiopian coffee. So a lot of positives that you could take away from it. Probably the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Halo Beriti wash processed Ethiopia from Fluid. Thank you for watching.